Thank you very much for attending. We're somewhat sparse in numbers, that hopefully some other people will join us. My name is Arthur Wood. I'm the founder of Equity for Humanity. We call it Equity for Humanity because what we're trying to construct is something that is equitable, socially equitable, but is also a financial opportunity. What we believe is a win-win for all society stakeholders, which we believe can actually crystallize billions to trillions of capital if you apply a systems approach. And in essence, the question we're trying to solve is the question today that was posed by Clinton. The problems of the 20th century have been solved by someone somewhere. The challenge of the 21st century is how we scale them. And that's the question we're going to try and address today. With the help of three individuals, perhaps I can ask them to come up on the stage. Audrey Sellian, Dr. Audrey Sellian, to get her name correct, the Chief Executive of Arthur Networks. Thank you very much, Audrey, lovely to see you. Professor Jean-Marie Le Goff from CERN, who is the technical advisor to IDE4. And Lyndon Bodin, who is the Accenture Development Partners Managing Director, their European League. Now, being a digital presentation, we of course have got some international speakers. We have got Sir David King, who will join us at round about 4:20, we hope 4:30. But first we will kick off with Daniel Goldman, who is the founder of Sims originally, a long-term investor in the space. So those are the people we have for you today. As I say, Daniel Goldman, Edge of Technology, Professor Sir David King. Then we're going to talk about the enabling technology, which is Jean-Marie and Lionel. And then the implications and the architecture, literally to mobilize billions to trillions. And then finally, and by no means least from Washington, D.C., Bill Kelly, who is a former board member of Ashoka, and Latham & Watkins to represent the legal team. We have what we call a founding collaboratory. Where did this idea came from? It came from these organizations. The Social Progress Imperative, True Footprint, that is one of the leaders in feedback mechanisms, the Arthur Network, Audrey here to my left-hand side, Catalyst 2030 is one of our key partners, that is the leading collaboratory of Ashoka, Skoll, Schwab. Accenture, Total Impact Capital, who's one of the, which I'm one of the founding partners of. The work of Dr. Guy Hutton from UNICEF, who is one of the leading mind thinkers in terms of externalities, and Professor Le Goff from CERN. This is just a quick touch in terms of who our legal counsel is. All former regulators, either charitable or financial. As I'll come into a moment, the legal dimension of this is very important. We have an advisory board that exists of leading leaders. Guy Hutton, I've touched on before. Mark Carpenani, some of you may know from the climate side. Giroux Billy-Morrow, who is one of the very well-known social entrepreneurs heading out Catalyst. Lionel here. And David Stevens, who is working on guarantee structures, of which I will touch on a little bit later. What I wanted to do, however, is start with this picture, my favorite picture. And it's by Niccolò da Michelino, and if you were looking at this picture, you would be standing underneath the Duomo in Florence. And on the left-hand side, and I apologize for a number of people in this room, on the left-hand side, he is pointing to the circles of hell. And on the fourth circle of hell, you find blasphemers, sodomites, mass murderers, and bankers. And on the right-hand side, he's pointing to Brunelleschi's dome that you would be standing under, which was funded by Medici, the banker. And in this picture is this whole contrast between for-profit and not-for-profit. We make our money on one side, and then we allocate it on the other. But there's a more profound message in this picture as well, because Medici was also the person that created the bond market. The bond market is the basis of the modern nation state. And you couldn't have created the bond market unless you'd had the creation of double-entry bookkeeping and the use of the numeric systems that were invented in the 50 years before that. If you go back even 200, 300 years before that, you'll find the Templars, For any British lawyers here, the Temple in London is, of course, where they were based. And the Templars were, of course, the bankers to modern Europe. Under a papal bull called Omnes Datum Optimum, they became the prevailing economic force for the Crusades. And again created trusts, first letters of credit, the first corporation, until they demised in 1307, Friday the 13th, when one of the few times you had the collaboration by the French and the English to actually kill off the bankers. And then if you go forward in history to ask yourself why a wet, soggy island off the coast of Europe in 1750, half the size of Le Roi de la France, became the dominant power a number of years later. Why? Because it borrowed from the Dutch an efficient banking system, and it borrowed an efficient taxation system. If you come forward again in history to the Bretton Woods system, you find that that is the basis of American power. What ties all these elements together? In each of these cases, there was a political need, whether it be the crisis between the church and the state, whether it be the need to fund your wars in cities to nations, whether it be the rise of the Anglo-Saxon sphere, whether it be American power. But the problem we face today is that when you look at our current system, and you look at all the funding that comes from governments and all the funding that comes from foundations, we have about 0.5% of global GDP. The problem we face is 8 to 14% of GDP. Now, we can continue discussing what we're going to do with the 0.5 in silos, but let us not fool ourselves that you would have to leverage that capital at a minimum 16 times to actually get you anywhere near where we want to be. So the practical reality is we are faced with a huge threat in terms of actually delivering everything we've talked about this week. Blended value and venture capital is not going to get us to where we need to be. It's very simple. It's maths. So what are the options that we can do? What are the sources of capital that we could actually mobilize? I've noted in the beginning the vision that we have, which is about social justice, climate, ecological justice, youth. It's matched by a number of what we call, which is the 4 elements, and you'll see there's 4 elements within the 4 elements. What we're going to deal with today is financial aggregation and sustainability, and the systems transformation. 4 tools: systems financing, systems planning, systems data, and systems innovation. And how do you integrate those 4 elements together? How do you take what the rest of the economy has done in defense, in politics, and the commercial life, and apply it to the development sector? Not how technology works in a silo, but actually how do you use the same revolution that is revolution as every other aspect of our lives and apply it to development? And we would argue that there's 2 key systems that this can be applied. This is plumbing. It can be applied to any system, but let's look at 2 key systems. One of which is cities and hinterlands, agricultural, which is what Daniel Goldman will touch upon from the agricultural perspective. I will look at it from the city side. This is where 70% of humanity will be by the year 2050. If we can't solve the problem in cities and their hinterlands, then we can't solve it anywhere. And the other element of this, which Sir David King, when he comes on the line, he will talk about a maritime opportunity, which again is roughly 70% of all the Earth's surface. These are 3 of the big systems: agriculture, cities and their hinterlands related to agriculture, and maritime systems. And if we can actually do that, if we can actually apply an integrated systems approach, which is what we're going to talk about in detail today, then you have an opportunity to do a number of things. You can potentially monetize the value of the externalities. These have all been calculated by Accenture, Brookings, the World Bank, Guy Hutton in sanitation. We know they're huge, $500 billion a year in terms of the externalities, ergo the damage done or the benefit created by a series of sequenced social interventions. Trillions of dollars in terms of the value. If you put $1 into education, it generates $50 of future economic value. So the externalities are huge, and in the same way we trade carbon, why can't we trade externalities and create mechanisms that the quicker you achieve the outcome, the higher the return? Secondly, mobilize the multi-trillion that is non-mission aligned. Bit of a sensitive subject, but the reality is foundations have $2 trillion, of which the vast majority of their balance sheets are unaligned. That's what we should be talking about, not the 5% that we get. How do we align those core funds? How can we talk to bankers saying, motivate capital, if our own core capital, we don't align it? The same with faiths, the third largest investors in the world. If you want to see innovation, look what's happening in Islamic funding. Many elements of it are very similar to impact investment. The words and the language are different, but in essence, the same concepts apply. Trillions of dollars. Islamic finance alone is $3 trillion. Structural inefficiency. This seems minor, but when you think about it, and this is World Bank research, if you actually apply a systems planning process to a city or a framework, we can provide you the figures later, World Bank peer review says you can actually take 45% of the cost out of the SDGs. Ergo, we think in terms of a system, we think in terms of collaboration, we think in terms of scale, as opposed to reinventing the wheel, small scale, silo by silo. The Glasgow report basically said there's $132 trillion. There is huge amounts of innovation in this space, which you've heard of this week. But it's sort of a conversation that goes, well, there's 132 trillion, and here are these products. We don't ask the question is, what is actually the architecture to actually leverage that capital? Including, as Sir David will touch upon, about the billions of dollars that can actually be mobilized by climate offsets if you do it in scale. And then finally, in terms of the billions to trillions, is local currency. Not widely known as a fact, but there are trillions of dollars that sit in the local currency pension funds. And we'll deal with this later, but there's an opportunity to leverage that capital for these countries' essential sustainable development. At 70% less risk than the current model, you can use $250 million to create an entity that's profitable, as opposed to actually putting 25 billion up to get $100 billion. So how can you innovatively use structures if you move in scale? Speak to any banker in this room, he will tell you everything is about AUMs. The more AUMs you rise, the more sophistication, the better the risk management. Finally, how do you get to measurement? We have three partners. One is the social progress imperative. You've probably seen their index recently, which enables you to look across the whole framework all the way down to the individual allocation of resources within a city. True footprint, which is about dynamic community real-time feedback. So make the data real-time. Make the communities auditors of their own good. Make the data real-time and usable so that it can be used as a pricing tool. And finally, IDA4, which I believe is revolutionary, which Jean-Marie will go into in greater detail, allows you to look at millions of pieces of data and text, and to identify the granularity inside that complexity, and to audit, track it, and pay it. Well, if you can audit, track it, and pay it, and finance would simply be another line, you put these three processes together, a process that looks across the whole value chain as opposed to the silo, with validated data real-time from the community, the real consumers, and on a data frame whereby you can now manage that complexity and track it in a systems approach, you end up with a data frame that's holistic, real-time, open, competitive, comparative, and predictive. It's the same model that you see with the same problems in every other sector of the economy. Connected and audited by the community, marrying multiple theories of change. At the moment, we all have our competing theories of change for perfection. If you've actually got a system that can look at millions of pieces of data, you can marry those. And it needs to be based, as we know from Mr. Trump and the Russians, it needs to be based in a governance environment that secures the importance of the multilateral system and its integrity. And we're completely open. This whole element of what we're talking about is open architecture. You will have a data set that works for you. Well, take the architecture, white label it, integrate it, and package it as your own. That's exactly what bankers do. It's no different. It's exactly the same as the banking sector does itself. We're now going to deal with two systems examples. First in terms of agriculture, which is Daniel Goldman, who hopefully is on the line. Daniel is ringing in from Tokyo, so he's stayed up reasonably late. He's the original founder of Sims, Netscape. He's been in the Silicon Valley virtually since its inception, and he's a technical entrepreneur and investor. So if we can connect through to Daniel. Daniel, good afternoon to you. Can you hear me?
Good evening for me. Good afternoon over there.
In which case, I'll hand over to you. Daniel.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit from an Equity for Humanity perspective about agriculture. I'm over here in Tokyo, as Arthur mentioned. I'm a co-director and co-founder of Edge of Technology, where we focus on applying human and IT technology to helping other people fulfill their missions and impact. And I'll go a little bit more into my background than I usually go, if I can get the slides properly advancing. There we go. Because I got my start with a game called SimCity, where I was the senior developer in a series of sim games. And what was wonderful about it was working with a brilliant business person, Jeff Braun, and a brilliant designer, Will Wright, and seeing how they were able to take these very complicated systems like a city or the whole earth and create something that made it accessible to the masses, that allowed people to engage in it, that allowed more talent basically to get involved. And over time, took some of that approach and brought it to working with the World Health Organization, the EPA, Superfund cleanup assistance tools, and training people around schistosomiasis. And that was an incredibly invaluable experience. And so it's a bit with that lens that we looked at agriculture and then tools to support changes and systemic changes, and kind of one of the roles we play with Equity for Humanity. So I'm going to talk a bit about some basic agricultural information for people in the audience who may not know, focusing then a little bit more on Africa, and then a little bit more on a project we were doing with Ethiopia, which got put on pause with the war and the pandemic that happened a couple of years ago, and the application of gamification and computer-aided design, not for technical products like a car and airplane, but for more important things like the whole world around us and how to solve these problems. So agriculture is, or was, a $3.5 trillion industry back in 2019. I say was because prices have skyrocketed. And somehow when things become more scarce, industries often make a lot more money. But it had been pretty stable globally at about 4% of GDP. The nice thing about that is it's big enough to be very significant, but if you look at it as a lever, it's a smaller percentage of GDP than a number of other industries that might be harder to move because of that. In terms of geographical scale, over a third of the land that's available is used for agriculture. So about 5 billion hectares out of about 13 billion hectares. And of that, 2/3 are permanent meadow pasture land, and only 1/3 is cropland. And the majority of it is really in Asia. I realize I'm skipping through this quickly in the interest of time, but hopefully it's people can see this well enough. One thing that was surprising for me when I learned it is only about 350 million acres are actually irrigated. And again, much of that in Asia. And this creates a huge opportunity for impact improvement, climate resilience, a huge opportunity to help people. In terms of global workforce, as you would expect, fewer and fewer people are working in agriculture, and even though it's down from 40% in 2000, it's still above a quarter of the people in the world work in agriculture, and even more so in Africa. And unfortunately, undernourishment has been on the rise again. And again, this is before the pandemic, really. This is before the supply chain issues associated with the pandemic, and before the increase in climate instability and Russia attacking Ukraine, which has created a lot of shortages in inputs as well as just plain in agricultural output, primarily from Ukraine. So it's a huge humanitarian crisis, and it's going to get worse if something isn't done about it. This was also surprising when I learned it, that a huge amount, about a third of the greenhouse gases that humanity creates, are from agricultural land, either directly what's called farm to gate or farm gate, which means within the property itself, or because of clearing forests in order to plant more cropland, like clear cutting for palm oil is a great example. So there's a huge opportunity here both to decrease the amount of CO2 being emitted, but it's also such a huge amount of land in order to sequester and offset CO2. If I focus in now on Africa, it's over 1 billion hectares of agricultural land. The opportunity to, in a relatively straightforward fashion, sequester or offset multiple gigatons of CO2. And in sub-Saharan Africa, over half the people are farmers, and over 20% of the GDP 2019 is from agriculture. And so this is it's a huge issue, the livelihood of the farmers, as well as, of course, the necessity of the food that comes out of it. When we talk about 3.5 trillion being the value of the agriculture, it really isn't accounting for the fact that without the agriculture, everything that comes after it isn't going to be there. We all depend on having food to eat, as unfortunately more and more people are becoming acutely aware. There's a huge opportunity for an increase in productivity. So McKinsey, with input from other organizations, that estimate that you can increase the productivity 2 to 3 times in a relatively straightforward fashion. So when we look at some of the interventions that you can do, people look at seeds and fertilizer. What are the inputs into the process that can be higher quality or add to the nutrients to increase the yield? And then what are kind of these infrastructure improvements you can make? So focusing in a bit on irrigation and storage, just right there, there's an opportunity to put in over $70 billion and potentially double or triple the yield. When we were looking at this for Ethiopia, it was 20 to 70% additional yield just by putting in irrigation without any of the other changes. In terms of the financial trends and the availability of capital in general, sustainable bond issuance has been going up by 50% or more per year for the last few years. The estimate was for it to be over $1 trillion in 2021. I didn't check the actual numbers for 2021, but it's a respectable amount of money. And you can imagine if this were moved into a systemic application, like Arthur was talking about, and something that allowed you also to fund for these future value streams, it would create an incredible opportunity for the people investing the money. And I think more importantly, an incredible opportunity for humanity in terms of the value to people in their real lives and stability around food, social stability, and productivity. Now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the project that we're doing in Ethiopia out of, it's called Prosperity Exchange. And where we're looking at very simple steps that can be taken supporting our NGO partner there to help farmers and to give people familiarity with that. So there are very simple things that these NGOs do at the front end, such as giving advice. The hard part is you have to train people to give the advice. You need to have the human capacity, and you need to have a funding mechanism and a model to do this. And it's extremely hard to do on a village by village basis if you're investing just a few $1,000s at a time, or even tens of thousands of dollars. You really need to get to scale to be able to have impact and to be able to afford to replicate what you're doing. That's also where the information technology comes in, which I'll get to a little bit later. This moves up through agricultural inputs, such as seeds and fertilizers that I mentioned. And then there's some of these infrastructure investments you can make, solar-powered irrigation, for example, or storage, or getting people tractors. These are all well-known routes to go down. They're not really risky. The risks you handle with insurance. But there's no cutting-edge technology here, really, in terms of, do these interventions work? Do they help farmers? The hard part has been the financing and the training of the human capital. And that's a lot of what Arthur and Equity for Humanity really talk about, how we can improve that system. One other thing that tends to surprise people is that the loan repayment rate is very high in these populations. So if you look on the left of this slide, it talks about numbers from One Acre Fund and Grameen Bank, where it's a 97 to 99% loan repayment rate, which is excellent. I'll quickly go through these in the interest of time, but we packaged the loans through a bond product. In transparency, this didn't make it all the way through because of the pandemic, in a few different tranches. So you start with fairly small loans that include fairly small loans that are really post-harvest. You also have ones on the seed and fertilizer side, which I mentioned, but you also need to provide help for labor, seasonal labor. This moves up the stack through things that provide group loans, kind of for tractors, for things that are more the capital expenditures, or allow groups of farmers to collaborate together, perhaps on food processing, on machinery to clean grain, up through what we call the prosperous village portfolio, which is ideally where you want to get, where you're making systemic change by investing in villages, larger amounts of money that you can ideally do across hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of villages. Like I said, you really want to get this up to where you can be investing billions of dollars to be able to do it effectively, and looking at where you can replicate a very similar pattern across an entire geography and allow the local people to decide how to adapt it. So we focused on an approach of collaboration, and you can see with Equity for Humanity, there are a number of organizations collaborating, including supporting the organizations on the ground as necessary. Entrepreneurship, because you really need the adaptive talent on the ground that has a local relationships that can do what's necessary to do locally that you'll never know arm's length and remotely, and being fairly disciplined in the approach, meaning you have to start with looking at the math and the numbers in terms of the reality for the agriculture, but also the reality of the financing, and figure out where you can pick the opportunities that are really fundable and will really be successful for the local people. As a companion to these financial instruments that Arthur has been talking about a little bit and I've touched on, we look at this field companion of a technology of tools really based on what we've done in game development and simulation that make it easier for people on the ground to collaboratively design solutions, to get real-time local agent and I want to move it around or add a second well and I have to go all the way back to some central office and find some expert with spare time on the team to reanalyze what I'm doing. It makes it very slow, but also makes it really expensive and it doesn't scale. When you put that into a technology platform, it's a little bit more investment up front, but then the incremental cost of scaling is almost nothing. You can get one of these tablets now for $35 US that you can deploy out into the field. It's pretty amazing. So this allows the local people to take control of it, to come up with designs and solutions within the framework that you've provided, and to see what's fundable, what'll work, what the outcomes might be, and very importantly, to deal with some of the administrative overhead. You can create applications for people automatically, submit them, know that loans are available, and provide execution support, all of which makes a huge difference when you talk to the NGOs on the ground and what the real problems are. It's often this human capital issue. It's hard to find people, it's hard to train them, and they need to be experts in so many things. And if you can reduce that burden, then they can scale a lot. The picture on the right here is from a data center we were building out in our building in Tokyo, in Shibuya, which is more of a national and corporate data center for groups to come together and do scenario planning. So this is all part of the water, food, energy nexus at Equity for Humanity, and a lot of this is going to be covered in upcoming presentations. I'll skip in the interest of time a lot of the recap, other than to say, looking at these geographical systems like Sir David King is going to talk about with the oceans, it's really helpful because there's such a scale there. There's so many billions of hectares. It covers so much of the earth. And there's an opportunity to help repair those systems, and in the process of repair the environment in terms of CO2, and also provide for humanity going forward in a sustainable fashion. And with the forward streams that Arthur talked about, it's incredibly, there's a high return on investment for people who are able to invest at that scale. And really the time is now. I saw this morning that I assume a lot of people saw out of The Guardian, the call to action from Alvaro Lario, the new head of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, that we need to invest in small farmers, or we're going to be increasingly facing these crises around food. And that's the only way we can really tackle poverty and everything else that stems on from it. That's it. If you have any questions, you can email me or Arthur or other people at Equity for Humanity, and thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. There is an example, if we think in a systems frame, where we finance in a layered fashion. We don't think about just it as agriculture. We think about the whole element of the value chain that can be brought to bear. And if we can move it to scale, then we have a conversation. We move beyond venture capital, and we have the ability to integrate a whole range of other capital market tools. We're now going to go to, hopefully, Sir David King. I'm hoping he's on the line, who is going to... Good afternoon, David. Sir David is the former UK scientific advisor, now at Cambridge, heading up a new global consortium focused on climate. Climate is clearly another huge systems opportunity, and I'm going to hand over to David. David, hopefully you can hear us. I will move your slides for you.
Thank you for the introduction. I am going to simply, first of all, talk about the nature of the climate crisis we're in, because there isn't sufficient understanding about it. And secondly, I will talk about the work that we are doing on the oceans and how we intend to use that vast area that you've just heard about. So if I could have the first slide, we'll dive straight into my presentation. So, no, that's not, I think that's the second slide, but I'm happy to take it if you don't want to. Okay, let's take that one. Extreme weather events have been occurring over the past 3 or 4 years much more frequently than before. And there is, I'm afraid, one simple reason for this. And it's the feedback from what is happening in the Arctic Circle region. And in this slide, I'm simply showing what has been happening since about 1880 to global temperature, shown in black. That's the global average temperature, rising not to 1.2 degrees centigrade. That was the average between 2010 and 2020. One of the big errors is to consider that is where we are today. We are now at 1.35 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level, closing in on that magic figure of 1.5. But look at the Arctic Circle region as a whole. That's their average annual temperature in red. And you'll see that there's a breakaway from the average for the whole planet about 15 years ago. And the Arctic Circle region is now over 3 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level for the Arctic Circle region. This is the fastest heating up area in the planet today. And the consequences of that are multiple. If we, can I have the next slide? If we look at the consequences, they are threefold. So first of all, I'm going to say Greenland is now sitting for 3 months in the year during the polar summer in a blue sea. The blue sea soaks up sunshine, the white ice reflects it away. So the Arctic Circle region is quite a warm region in the polar summer months. And what that means is that the Greenland is now losing ice irreversibly. Irreversibly, I'm using that word carefully. It means that sea levels will eventually rise by 6.5 to 7 meters due to the melting of the ice that's sitting on Greenland. And due to, we're not counting in what's happening to the Himalayas, what's happening to the Antarctic as well. So there's a massive sea level rise built into what I'm now describing to you. Even by mid-century, the country of Vietnam will be 90% under seawater at least once a year. So the consequences are not that far away from where we are today. The second thing is that in the land mass around the North Pole, we have a vast amount of methane trapped as methane hydrates in that cold ice. But some of it is being explosively released again during those polar summer months. And if if that methane was all emitted over a period of, let's say, 20 to 24 years, the temperature rise globally would be 5 to 8 degrees centigrade. So there is another risk attached to this. The extreme weather events are because the wind that blows around the North Pole in an anti-clockwise direction, the jet stream, is now seriously distorted, especially again during the polar summer months, and this is giving rise to extreme weather events throughout the northern hemisphere, in particular during the 3 summer months. The costs to the insurance and reinsurance sector from these massive challenges to our land masses is enormous. It's certainly increased very dramatically. On this slide, I'm just showing you the average summer temperature in Central Europe over the past more than 100 years. And if you had very sharp eyes, you'd be able to pick out when we had that extreme hot summer in 2003. It looks like a very small peak in that black curve. The black curve is the average temperature. The red curves are just running forwards, taking all of the extreme weather events occurring according to the model. Now, what we see is that the 2003 extreme weather event, where perhaps 70,000 people lost their lives in Central Europe as a result of that heat wave, doesn't look like a big bump at all. So we are now seeing the average temperature every year, well in excess of that extreme hot summer back in 2003. So there's what is happening in Central Europe, and there's the prediction for 2100 if we stay on the current trajectory. And at the moment, I regret to say there's no sign that we're departing from that trajectory. Of course, we're all hoping that this will switch as we begin to see the move away from fossil fuels biting into the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. However, next slide, please. What I do want to say is that we have taken our planet too far towards a very unstable future. The so-called tipping points, and the climate scientists have picked up 15 of these tipping points around the planet. The so-called tipping points will tend to go at anywhere between 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level and 5 degrees centigrade. But I've just said to you 3 degrees centigrade is where the Arctic Circle region is now above the pre-industrial level. And sure enough, what I'm saying to you is that the tipping points in the Arctic Circle region have already gone. So we're talking about an example of self-organized criticality. We have watched this happening in a self-organized way in the Arctic Circle region as a result of the increase in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the conclusion has got to be that we must have deep and rapid emissions reduction, but we also recognize surely now that we have put too much in the way of greenhouse gases up there already. Every ton we keep emitting now will have to be removed in the future to create a safe and manageable future for humanity. But if we look at that second requirement, then we have to reduce emissions deeply and rapidly. We have to remove greenhouse gases at scale. And doing that means that we have to remove something like 30 to 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year to get ourselves back to a safe area. And we're not going to do it, even at 30 billion tons a year before the end of the century. So we haven't got the time to wait because of what's happened in the Arctic Circle region already. And so the third challenge is to refreeze the Arctic. And we set up the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge a few years ago, and the centre is operating globally as a hub to see that all 3 R's are followed, but we are in particular developing the processes that will be able to tackle both the reduced, removing excess greenhouse gases and also the refreezing. And I'm just going to talk about the second one for the few moments left to me now. And this brings me to the oceans. 72% of the world's surface is the oceans, of which the major part is the deep oceans of the world. The deep oceans of the world had a vast number of whales in them, in addition to a vast number of fish, including crustaceans. And we managed to capture whales to get their blubber over previous years. And so in that process, we have reduced the baleen whale population, that is the whales that have a lot of blubber, we reduced their population to a very small amount over the last 300 or 400 years. And the blue whale, the biggest of all, is down at probably 1% of where the population used to be. And we never understood the biological function of these whales in the oceans. The whales tend to eat krill, especially the blue whale. These whales eat krill about 300 to 500 meters below the sea level. It's cold down there. They need the blubber to keep themselves warm, but they have to come up both for air, but also to relieve themselves, because at 300 to 500 meters below sea level, orifices are all jammed shut of any mammal, and so as it rises up, they grab hold of air, but they also alleviate themselves. And so I'm just showing you a picture, a fairly recent picture, of a bunch of whales coming up together, a pod of whales, and they immediately defecate, and the ocean is filled with their whale poo. And the point is that whale poo acts as fertilizer to generate a green area. And the green area, as a result of a pod of whales coming up, might cover an area of 1,000 square kilometers or more. That area will take up a vast amount of carbon dioxide in creating a layer of phytoplankton and zooplankton. The phytoplankton is the initial foodstuff of fish larvae that hatch from fish eggs, every type of fish. And the fish larvae have to have phytoplankton. So where these areas form, you very quickly develop a vast population of fish. And by vast, I mean up to 500 million in an area of the kind I've just described. And so what we are interested in is creating artificial whale species that we can spread over areas of the ocean, the deep ocean surface, in order to imitate what the function of the whales was. And if we keep repeating that over a period of time, we expect that the fish population of the oceans and the mammal population of the oceans, including the whales, will be very significantly increased if we can do this fully at scale. We're doing experiments now with our consortium, and our favored target for the artificial whale species, next slide, is in fact, there's the whale and the critical function of the species. And next slide, I hope, the next slide, I'm racing through this now. And the one after. Our favored imitation of whale species is the matter that is thrown up by volcanic eruptions. And so we've very heavily studied the volcanic eruptions recently happening in 2018 in Vanuatu and in 2021-22 in Tonga. And in particular, the Tongan volcanic ash, it turns out, has got the missing nutrients in the surface of the ocean. It's got the nitrates, phosphates, the silicates, and the iron that are needed to fertilize the ocean surface. And so where the deposit of the volcanic ash falls onto the ocean area is greened, and of course the fish stock rises as well. So we're trying to use volcanic ash as a potential for managing to artificially mimic the function of the whales. And after 30 or 40 years, we believe we can then leave the whales to continue the process. And in the process, restocking the deep oceans with biological species. And the deep oceans, many of them today are more like land-based deserts. But at the same time, we will be taking up anything between 5 and 15 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year, particularly carbon dioxide, of course. that big spread of options there between 5 and 15 is because it's actually very difficult to estimate how much carbon would be captured in total and fully sequestrated. So there's the description. I have taken up all of my time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, David. So when you're basically arguing that in terms of a systems approach, you are increasing the fisheries populations, which clearly has an impact then on the domestic communities locally nearby, and the carbon offsets are potentially huge from a banking perspective. At $20 a shot, you will recognise whether it's 5 or 15 billion tonnes. That is obviously a potential substantive opportunity. So there are these systems, if you begin to look at the ocean as a system or the cities as a solution, you begin to understand that the ramifications of moving in scale along those capital market solutions that we outlined earlier are very substantial. If I can move on today and really ask the question, if those are the systems approaches in terms of cities, in terms of agriculture, in terms of climate, do the digital tools actually exist to actually solve that problem? Indeed, are they actually even here in Geneva, potentially? And I also see that Nicholas Nigley is in the audience here. Nicholas, you are rather one of the founders of building bridges and are clearly, obviously, very into the issue. Perhaps you'd like to join us, because I know that this is of a particular interest to you in terms of this linkage between the technology and its implication for building the bridges. But Professor Le Goff, if I hand over to you, perhaps what's some of this technology that can help us crystallize these types of systems opportunities?
Okay, thank you. Can you show the slides, please? All right, so before talking about solutions, we have to be able to really understand the problem. We are dealing with what we call in science complex systems, namely systems where you have a huge number of elements that interact with one another, not necessarily directly, and some event somewhere, it can be energy or information for the interaction, but some event somewhere may propagate throughout a huge part of the system. And in that respect, these are systems that cannot be managed centrally. And for computer science and IT solutions, it means that, if I may use that expression, you have to let it go, all right? So could you go to the next slide, please? So this is the sort of the data part of a complex system, which means the community working on understanding what COVID-19 is all about. And as you can see, a huge number of different...
Je rencontre quelques problèmes de connexion. Veuillez réessayer plus tard.
Sorry?
I think you're still connected, Jean-Marie. It's somebody else. I think you're fine.
I beg your pardon. I don't know how to stop that. So could you take it off? Okay, I'm very sorry. I don't know what's... Okay, so here you have different contributors working in different systems, and the whole thing is that the different stakeholders have different interests. But what is the sort of the thread is the data generated, and how people can use the data, make judgment out of this data, and possibly find solutions to the different problems at stake. Next, please. So, and essentially, once you have sort of this data, well, we all know that it is essentially in silos, but you need to essentially use 3 different kinds of, I would say, IT techniques. Okay, the first one is information retrieval. Why? Because if you have a huge amount of data, okay, you must obviously try to find out what you are really looking for, what's the subset that really matters to your inquiry first. But then, when you have retrieved this information, it's a bit like just, pushing some words into a box for Google, and then you get 15 million answers. So which one is good? Which one is more interesting to you? Well, you don't know, actually. So you need to explore this data set. And today, Google doesn't make that available to you, okay? And this is really the first step before you conduct any kind of data analysis or run any kind of data science software, because first of all, you must know what to find, what to explore within this extremely complex data environment. And as we are not normally IT specialists, but domain experts, we want to rely on advanced techniques such as data visualizations, which will give you a direct insight into the data rather than you trying to write all kind of code that probably will never meet your expectations and make you waste time, whereas you have experts that can do that for you. Next, please. All right, so now I think it's quite clear that stakeholders will have to rely on data to get insight into complex systems in order to make proper decisions. And what we call data science is actually the discipline that provides the mean to extract knowledge and insight out of the data. But there again, you have to do the retrieval and the exploration prior to effectively being able to make use of data science, for the simple reason that otherwise you get an answer which is a mess, because you don't know what the answer means, essentially. Next. Now, we started with complex systems. So actually, data is far more complex than what you can expect in a spreadsheet or what you can run with Tableau and the like. Why? Because data is connected. What does it mean? It means that in a single line of your spreadsheet, the different cells have actually a connectivity that is meaningful to that particular row. The second row may have another connectivity. Now, if you have something like 20 or 200 columns in your spreadsheet and you have more than 10,000 lines, which is very typical of the kind of examples I gave you for COVID, for instance, then obviously, charts that you normally get from data science will not be that meaningful because you will not be able to explore the connectivity. So in the last 10 years, there is a new science that started, which is called network analytics, which actually use graph techniques to actually understand the connectivity to complement what you get normally from data analytics. Next. So, in summary, applying data science and networks techniques in order to effectively allow you to visualize, track, and manage the complex systems requires data exploration and visualization, data science, and network analytics. And that should be accessible, obviously, to all stakeholders and all players within the system. So what we have done at CERN in the last 10 years almost is to develop concepts and manage to put together what we call an advanced visualization technology. This technology is based on exploiting the connectivity of the data, and this tool is particularly suitable when you have extremely complex connectivity among the different parts of the data coming from the different contributors. And essentially, we have tested this on different applications, procurement data, in particular. On philanthropy, there is already an application on medicine, where actually the idea is to assist the surgeon with a view to helping him making better judgment and taking decisions out of the predictions from AI. And we are discussing with WIPO for a patent analytics tool. And the whole idea there is every time we are using the same sort of technology, what differs is essentially the AI part and the data processing. But at the end, whatever project contributes to the development of the different parts will actually service all the other projects. So it is all open access, MIT 2.0, everybody can join, obviously, but the whole idea is to use it and put it onto different projects, either for-profit or non-for-profit, with a view to effectively developing a new culture based on advanced visual analytics approach to effectively take better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. If I can preface essentially what you said, what technology is giving us the ability to do is obviously to analyze complexity far more effectively, but also to track the granularity inside that complexity. And that obviously, if we collaborate, has substantive ramifications, both politically and commercially. And if I can sort of hand that question over to Nicholas and Lionel, I don't know which of you want to go first, but what in your view, perhaps Nicholas first, are the implications for Geneva and indeed the potential competitive advantage for Geneva and why we see this as a potentially very important technology?
Yes, thank you so much, Arthur. First of all, thanks for the impromptu invite. Thanks for spotting me. It's always great to be called up on the stage when you get into a meeting. I'm coming from another quite significant event today in this ecosystem, the Lemanic ecosystem, Trust Valley. How to make technology a tool for planet and humanity rather than a weapon. And so to come back to building bridges and to essentially come in after Jean-Marie, who spoke about technology and how we can accelerate things, is very, very in line with what I had to discuss before. But let me perhaps start in my answer to the question with the ambition we had when we started this building bridges collaboration and the movement. You mentioned systems thinking and systems action. Collaboration has to become the new normal, quite clearly. Transdisciplinary collaboration is where we will move the furthest. That's where the most innovation, I guess, is going to happen. And obviously, we have to have all the stakeholders on board. This is exactly what we do here at Building Bridges. We have to walk the talk, so we can't just build bridges. We have to walk over them, but we have to speed up. We have to run the talk. And there is this this African proverb, right, which sort of says, if you want to go fast, you have to go alone, and if you want to go far, you have to go together. I think the trick here is we need to go fast and far. And the only way we can create both of these elements is by supercharging the movement through technology. That's where we are. So that brings me to the importance of building bridges, not just at the physical level, but also at the data level. Geneva has plenty of very valuable data troves. All of these stakeholders we brought together here in building bridges have very valuable data. But again, alone, it's going to be really difficult to make a big difference. Together, we can possibly go much further. But immediately, when you start talking about data and data visualization and analytics, as Professor Le Goff just spoke about, the question becomes, well, who will reveal that, the interconnectivity? Who will essentially provide the tool for this data to make sense for planet and humanity? And I think, and this is, I think, the sense of what we are trying to discuss here, there is a need for a revolution around, I would say, technological commons. Professor Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, spoke a lot about the value of commons for society long-term development. I would argue in the 21st centuries we need a technology common revolution. And I think bridges will have to be generated at that level. That's essentially what I wanted to add at this stage. This is probably where one of the really, really big opportunity of this ecosystem lies. If we can make sense of these data bridges, if we can accelerate the formation of these data bridges, these data collaborations, then truly we can supercharge the running of the talk. That's what I wanted to add at this stage. Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. No, thank you for appearing out of the blue. I think the point that's being made here is that the technology to look at a systems frame and to work and to collaborate and break down silos now exists. The question is whether we want to take that challenge and actually collaborate, share costs to leverage that. Which maybe I can hand over to you, Lionel. I mean, you sit on the hard corner of the interaction between technology and our world. What would be your view?
Well, and I think that's very interesting, because if I build on what Nicolas shared, is that how do you create the trust valley? Because if you think about it, you know, what Arthur explained about equity for humanity, it's about building a system which is complex by nature. And so if we want to really invest in this system, we need to build trust. So I have often this question to that, what has changed in the world of data? And yes, it's sure, you know, technology has changed, but I think maybe a more profound change for me is that everyone can produce data. So I don't know how many had the experience yesterday with the screening of The Territory. It's a movie I can recommend, you know, and I think everyone was moved, you know, by this story. So you see how an indigenous people in Brazil are using technology and providing evidence through videos, through data points, to coordinate, and they have, well, not won the Bolsonaro government, but they have paralyzed, you know, the Bolsonaro government. And that's a very micro example that you can see that technology is bringing transparency, and especially when it is a voice of community. And so that's why when Arthur was introducing the concept of equity for humanity, we are taking, you know, the voice of communities into account. I have an example I can give you, which is not a full systemic approach, but something that exists right now. You might be aware, and building on what Sir David King, you know, said, that coral reefs are very important. You know, they are very important for biodiversity, but that's also very important for all the livelihood activities that exist around coral reef. The good news is that 70% of the coral reef are actually currently monitored. And it is often monitored by local association, you know, small organization. So we have been partnering with the Australian Institute for Marine Science to build a platform called Reef Cloud. And Reef Cloud is a platform that aggregates all the data from these local associations and trying to make, you know, the sense of what works in terms of preservation of coral reef. And you would argue, what sort of data? Simple pictures and a bit about, you know, the intervention that they are doing. And then, you know, we built, you know, on the back end, you know, advanced artificial intelligence, you know, advanced techniques in order to make sense of all these hundreds of thousands of pictures, you know, that we are receiving from all over the world. So I think this aggregation of grassroots data and voice of the community data are very important to take into account in the system. So if I step back, you know, for me, the trust valley comes with maybe 4 attributes. You know, you have the transparency, and, you know, I won't comment about all the digital technology that allows to secure, you know, so the transparency. You have openness, and I think Audrey might talk about that, you know, because if you think about all what the components that we are using in equity for humanity, they are all open components in order to facilitate the participation. You have something which is around simplification, and I think Jean-Marc talked about that. You know, visualization is a way to simplify. I mean, you have, Jean-Marc is an explorer on data, but, you know, I personally, I'm not really an explorer. I need to understand, you know, the first time, you know, I see something, you know, in order for me to direct, you know, my action. But I think the last point is about, you know, creating a platform for dialogue, because, I mean, even, you know, with the best data, you know, there won't be an automatic answer. And I think, you know, what Daniel showed about, you know, this war room where you can bring, you know, collaboration is very important. I mean, even in, I would say, the normal investing world, you have a lot of financial data. I don't think you take investment decision, you know, without having a solid and decent conversation about it. Yeah. So I think that's, you know, for me, the 4 components that are very important to build, you know, well, maybe the start of the Trust Valley.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. So the technology, so we've heard that there are systems framings that we can use in scale. We've heard that technology exists to actually allow us to crystallize and track and work as a system, as opposed to asking the question, how do we apply technology silo by silo? And that then gets to the question of actually, how do we monetize this? What's of interest to the bankers? And I'm very happy to introduce Audrey Sellian of Arthur Networks, also of Rianta Capital, to perhaps touch on that question. Audrey.
Thank you, Arthur. So Arthur and I know each other for about maybe 15 years now, so he understands my need to use cartoons to begin. We are fundamentally, at the moment, I think, trying to grapple with so many disparate components and, you know, this talk of complexity and, you know, vast systems. And I think the issue is that we are, at the moment, not at a place of sort of clear visibility on what we can actually do. So how do we land this conversation? We've heard about agricultural systems, we've heard about the oceans and whales, all the different solutions that are emergent out there. And so, next slide. I'd like to offer a view from our perspective of what I call la salade mêlée, the mixed salad of platforms, networks, convenings. This is just an illustrative snapshot on the back of a study we did 4 years ago for a German foundation, tracking how much infrastructure has been built to capture all the various interventions that are underway. And I come at this from the perspective of a humble, you know, impact investor deploying a small amount of capital for a private family. I've been investing on behalf of this family for 16 plus years directly in India, in last mile service models for the most part, trying to boost and support businesses that are serving the underserved. So small private equity, small tickets. You realize very quickly that, you know, one unitary actor can't move the needle. We have to collaborate and syndicate, but the mechanics of that very quickly surpass individual capabilities. You have to have enough hours in the day, and there just aren't any, and there aren't that many tools that help facilitate this process. Now, you'd think that by joining these networks, it would become suddenly extremely and completely obvious that, you know, oh, well, we can share information here, we can, shoot a data profile over there. We also built, we're on this, in this mixed salad. We're a nice colored tomato somewhere. Artha Impact is a platform that was formed in 2008 for India. We thought, okay, there's another 150 or so other India-focused impact investors who share our values. Let's share our deal flow. And more specifically, let's share due diligence. As anathema as that may sound to the VC mind or the private equity, the seasoned private equity investor, if our goal is impact, we're okay to share due diligence, provided that this may actually provide a conducive environment for, it may not be syndication, but it may be just passing deals on in a coherent flow over time as they evolve and mature. Let's go to the next slide. The issue is truly, it's, we realize that it comes down to two things when you're building such platforms and networks: design and intention and humility, three things. Without the design of interoperability and information share, and in very technical terms, APIs, if you're building a platform, a tool, a database, you must build in an API, even if you don't switch it on right away. And even if it's not clear, with whom you may be able to find the most, salient synergies, having essentially, it's the old Clipper chip reference. And the old, I think it was in the 70s or 80s when these software producers were, building big systems, and they put in that evil Clipper chip, which was the backdoor where they were sucking data out. This is the Clipper chip for sustainability, collaboration, and impact. It's just set it up so that you can eventually think to connect it to other peers. Without this flow, and without having some sort of, sort of stated objective when you have a network and a series of networks, we aren't going to get there. But the reality is, on that previous slide with hundreds of systems, there's billions of dollars of absorptive capacity reflected in those systems. There's absolutely no question that a lot of these networks today are capturing the interventions, the solutions, the innovators that will solve some of these problems. At the moment, though, what's been missing to date is essentially the incentive structure to get people to play nicely with each other. And this comes back to Arthur's idea and concept at Equity for Humanity. If we can just move forward. So Arthur speaks about a couple of core components: structural, metrics. The mindset goes without saying. The technical, which we speak to, in just very practical terms. If you want to syndicate against you, with your deal flow, there has to be a mechanism to find the other 65 people who have the same goals as you in the state of Tamil Nadu looking at agriculture, for example. It's beyond the pale for any one of us to hold in our minds the number of contacts that we need to be able to make this effective. I think that's called Dunbar's Law. And so technical solutions are one small but important piece of the puzzle. And of course, the financial innovation is key. The next slide is, let me show you a couple of quick snapshots of what we mean with a technical solution. This is our little mousetrap. It's not the best mousetrap, but it's one of them that helps capture, and Arthur, if you can click twice, profiling, visibility. This is a deal pipeline snapshot. And then one more time. An enterprise profile, and then one more time. Yeah, sorry, back. Due diligence. A due diligence workflow that allows for coordinated due diligence. This is one thing that we've built. There are hundreds of other systems doing similar work, and what's been missing to date is this fabric of incentive structure to be able to achieve the kind of 40% in cost savings on the actual modalities of deploying the billions and eventually the trillions. So next slide is the last slide. This was borrowed from Lionel. Today we're talking about hundreds and thousands of investors and funds and donors who are doing their bilateral thing. Everybody's looking at their own portfolio, their own deal flow. Some of the great funds that we've collaborated with, we've learned so much from, but a fund is a self-interested animal and is looking at its management fee and its carry. That's all great, but imagine if we can break that silo, not only using technology tools, but legal structures that align those incentives of the 125 funders who all look at agri in Tamil Nadu, just like us. So we're looking at some of these kind of layers and levels of intervention that can support plug-and-play infrastructure, that can connect, and essentially, as a first step, simply provide visibility on what everyone else is doing. And I'll leave it to Arthur to summarize all the rest, because that is really at the core, the heart of the concept of equity for humanity. But I hope I've been able to convey in just a few brief words that the tools are there. The customization at the end nodes is very easy. It's there. Everybody can run their own system and their platform with their wrapper and their branding and their niche. And we look at artisans in Angola. Great. The key is the connectivity between the walled gardens of data. And so with that, I'll pass you to Arthur.
Thank you very much, Audrey. And the irony of this entire approach is this is what the bankers did 20 years ago as they moved from product solutions to integrated customer solutions. And in some senses, what we're arguing is that the systems technology to do it in a very complex area, like development, in a systems level, exists. The ability to track and granularly pay each of the individual stakeholders and to incentivize each of those individual stakeholders in a complex system. And if we can do that, it has huge opportunities. We mentioned to billions to trillions. I touched on them before, and I'll go through them very quickly. This is looked at in terms of cash flows. Where we are currently is the base case on that left-hand side. Blended value and venture capital PE. The reality is that is not going to get us there. However, if we do what the bankers do, collaborate, take solutions, white label, grow AUMs on a systems level, it offers you the ability to inject a whole range of capital market solutions, a whole range of opportunities for social entrepreneurs within markets. If we then monetize the value of what they create. And how you do that is to look at this, as somebody's touched on this before, nexus funding. So you create, for example, as we've looked into in a city, you create a nexus around water, sanitation, health, agriculture, climate. They're all interrelated. They all have cash flows. They all diversify. They all reduce risk. That gives you a fund of probably around about $200 million for a reasonably mid-sized city. You then layer youth onto that. You then layer gender onto that. You then realize that you can actually then capture the value of that intervention to a range of players, and I'll comment to that. And then as you move out on the same architecture, you scale. And as you scale, the unit cost falls, the financial product and sophistication increases, and you actually create a mechanism of increasing predictability of outcome. And in all these cases, you are increasing the amount of cash flow. Very simply, as I say, you plug and play and do exactly what the bankers do. So we talk about, at Glasgow, 132 trillion intended for climate goals. UN per I talk about aligning capital markets, but we have a range of products if you read the report. You need the technology. You need the financial incentive structure, the catalytic capital, to make it work in terms of scale. Don't reinvent in silos, which is what we do in the moment. Plug and play existing financial innovation into aggregated markets. It's what the bankers do on the private banking side. We need to move from a venture capital paradigm to more of a private banking solution where you're aggregating solutions and scale. And as you've heard, the technology and the legal frame exists to do that. We should be asking the question to the foundations and the faith investors. What you're doing in grant is fine. So I'm going to ignore that first line there, though there's clearly things they can be doing in terms of catalytic. But we should be asking, how do we leverage the balance sheet, their whole balance sheet, not just the 5% that they give away? The use of program-related investment in the United States. If you created a cell company leveraging off some of the more sophisticated financial tools that you can move in cell, it means they can have their individual silo that they care about, but they leverage off the balance sheet and the solutions of larger financial tools. If you can actually make the social value, crystallize that social value through technology, I'll explain further, then in essence you can create structures whereby the quicker you create the social outcome, the higher the economic return. What does that mean? That means you can align the $2 trillion that you've actually got sitting on your balance sheet, probably investing in things that are contrary that you wanted to do, to actually investing in social outcome. We mentioned externalities. If you can do what we talked about before, the social progress imperative, go and look at it. It's been done for cities, it's been done by the European Union, it's been driven down to actually the allocation of resources inside cities. Take a look at their COVID vulnerability index, a look at 500 American cities and how you allocate social resources inside cities. That creates a competitive, comparative framework. So when you make an incentive, it cuts across the whole value chain. Take a look at the work of True Footprint, whereby they're 1.5 billion, 3,000 projects. You can create a feedback loop directly from the community. So the community becomes not a charitable beneficiary, it becomes the auditor and empowered consumer of those social goods in real time. And if you then take a look at what ID4 and drill down into what Jean-Marie has said, it means you can analyze those millions of pieces of data and text to actually be able to track them, to track and to granularly pay them. So let me give you some examples of contingent payments. So we talked about these huge returns that McKinsey, Accenture, World Bank have all calculated. If you, for example, take a look at a place like Kisumu, for example, in Africa, if you clear the water hyacinth, then the $400 million fisheries industry that has almost died, of course, would be prepared to pay a contingent payment based on that social intervention. The real estate value along the side of the rake is going to go up by a factor of 5 because you now have sustainable tourism. The government, if you digitize the city, will get more than the 5% that it gets because of corruption. You can move it to 30%. They're prepared to contingently pay. So when you look at the value of social outcomes that are being calculated by McKinsey, Accenture, World Bank, Stop TB, and these are huge, $1 creating $50 of value in the case of TB, just to pick that, or indeed in education with the report that Accenture, Brookings and ourselves did some time ago. These are the potential values that we don't recognize, but they're very clearly the future cash flow values of sequenced social interventions. There are your sequenced social interventions because they can now be identified with the technology. This is no different than, for example, looking what is happening in Ukraine today. The defense sector did this years ago. A defense sector, they allocate their resources in real time in a complex way. Unless they get it right, they are dead. We don't even use the word sequenced in the word social sector. We need to take the learning in hard power and apply it to hard power. So the ability to trade the externalities, the future cash flow that comes from all this fantastic innovation you've seen last week, sequenced, identified and tracked. Interesting. There's a very interesting opportunity. People assume there is no capital in the developing world. There is trillions of dollars that sits on pension funds in local currencies. You could create, with the right capital structure, a guarantee entity for $250 million that would guarantee local bonds in local currency for their own essential sustainable development. This has been done. A group over 27 years has done $21 billion worth of business. They've accounted in the structure at 160 basis points. It's come out at 9 times. That means conservatively, you could leverage your capital between 5 to 18 times. The figures we'll use now will be roughly 6. That means for a $250 million investment, you can create an entity with a 20% IRR, and this has been done to death by the hedge funds, which would be at 70% less risk because you're taking all the foreign exchange risk out. And because you can manage the process, you can actually, as opposed to do individual deals, you can actually manage your process risk. This is the opportunity of blended value. Do we continue to do individual bonds in individual silos with the foreign exchange risk? Or do we actually create a guarantee entity to mobilize the capital that means for the $250 million, you can mobilize your $100 billion? It's, to quote the UN Secretary General's appointee to WASH Sanitation, a no-brainer. Why don't we do it? Because it's been attempted 3 times now. We don't do it because the banks like to lend in hard currency. But that's hugely risky. And it's about to become more risky because we're about to get inflation and foreign exchange that we haven't worried about. So it's not that these technology tools exist, they do. If you drive operational efficiency, World Bank peer review research in terms of systems planning, ergo looking at a system as agriculture or climate and actually applying system tune, give the community themselves the systems tools to actually create the difference in their own communities, you can see the cost there. We can continue as business as usual, 8.25% of cost. Or we can apply a systems planning model, 4.5% of GDP, an annual saving of 3.6 trillion. So it's not an issue of product. It's not an issue of applying technologies. These all exist, the technology to track and do, the issue of trust. But we choose not to. And we choose not to because of the intermediary frameworks within which we operate. And if we are really honest and we want to look at our children in the eyes, we can no longer continue to claim that the current system is working. It simply mathematically cannot work. But the technology and the tools and processes have been designed. I'm going to hand over very briefly to Bill Kelly, because we've touched on the technology, so we need to be very quick about this. But Bill, I'm hoping you're on the line from Washington, D.C. Perhaps in 5 minutes you can, I apologize, you can basically explain the work of the series of regulators, former regulators, both charity and financial in terms of the work about making this doable. Bill. I'm not sure we can hear you.
Thank you, Arthur.
Yep.
Thank you, Arthur, for the introduction. It's my great pleasure to join all of you this morning from Washington. Arthur and Audrey have outlined an ambitious approach to making real progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. That approach would address the shortcomings of the siloed approaches that have dominated the development field for decades. My role is to introduce the legal innovation this approach entails and its role in mobilizing capital. From a legal and governance perspective, the challenge is to envision a structure that would attract the capital needed to carry out this transformative work, and of equal importance, assures the fair and just distribution of the value that it creates. To assist whether such a structure can be created, we convened a working group of highly experienced lawyers and regulators with many areas of expertise. Based on their knowledge and experience, we're comfortable that such a structure can be formed under current law using a partnership or similar structure that mixes multiple sources of capital and explicitly locks in the social mission. Of course, the detailed structuring of this would have to take into account the laws of the multiple countries in which the work will be done, and also the tax and regulatory regimes of the investors' home countries. But we think all of that is feasible. A key element of focusing on of assuring focus on the social mission. I'm sorry, I've lost this track here. A key element of assuring focus on the social mission is what we call the local integrity hub, displayed on this first slide. That hub, the investor partnership, and the other key institutions in the structure will be hardwired in their organizational documents to prioritize their social mission. The community auditors will report directly to the Integrity Club, creating a community-based system of transparency and accountability. The terminology of this can, of course, be adapted to work whose locus is not local. For example, the global maritime undertaking that was outlined by Sir David earlier in this discussion today. Turning to the next slide, you will see that the financing structure will include several classes of investors in the same capital stack. The law in multiple countries can accommodate the differing goals of multiple classes of investors for sure. These could range from conventional return-oriented investors to corporations with an economic interest to foundations and others. For example, as Arthur mentioned, a U.S. foundation could make a so-called program-related investment for a social purpose, as long as it's willing to accept a below-market return, and even if the other investors expect a market return. Or a foundation, corporation, or government could make further financial contributions conditioned upon the success of the work in their areas of interest. The next slide features the impact of the focus on hardwiring the social mission. The incentives for the parties would now be aligned with the social mission. Local communities would be paid for their work as auditors of the results. Social entrepreneurs would be rewarded individually for the value they create. They would earn a return, pari passu, with the investors. And finally, social intermediaries would be compensated for their roles in bringing people together. The next slide introduces the local hub. This is where the elements of the concept would come together. The local hub would have responsibility for planning, policy, administration, and knowledge distribution. It would be centered around the community, supporting and working with local NGOs and partners. It would receive funding from the capital stack and pass that funding on to social entrepreneurs and operating businesses. And they, in turn, would carry out the work that achieves the social development goals. The social entrepreneurs would retain an equity interest, and the local hub would have a formal contractual relationship with the Integrity Hub and with Equity for Humanity. The next slide illustrates the flexibility of the financing model that we are calling plug and play. The strategy seeks to mobilize the estimated $3 to $4 trillion of pension funds in emerging and frontier markets. In this example, a green bank could provide a guarantee to local currency investors, thus expanding the sources of investment capital. The final slide brings all of this together. The result is a legal and governance structure that has been enacted in many jurisdictions globally. The structure allows for funding from different sources to mingle and prioritizes social mission by rewarding communities as auditors and social entrepreneurs as equity holders for the value they create. The model is primed to help unlock 5 capital streams that represent trillions of dollars of capital globally. With that, I'll turn it back over to Arthur.
Was saying there was that if you can identify the granularity with the technology, the legal framework then allows you to actually crystallize and track that value. So it gets to Audrey's point about actually being able to granularize the incentive structure to each of the players. So it's this mix of technology with legal. I think we could probably call it a day there. I'll just very briefly say this is the structure that we have at mind. It's an open structure. We look to create this virtuous circle going from systems transformation to the systems work you read, to the legal innovation that allows the capital mobilization, to then creating replication and scale on the same model. As Jean-Marie said, 80% of his cost is more or less fixed cost. So as this model scales, the unit cost falls, the impact increases because predictability increases as you go forward, and the unit cost effectively drives. So the model is about being open. So we're not trying to sell you a Stalinist solution here. What we're trying to sell you is collaboration, and collaboration where you can white label, you can collaborate. Because as an individual social entrepreneur, there's roughly $65 million worth of technology conservatively that has already been built. Don't build it yourself. This is our funding requirement going forward. You can see on the left-hand side there, the commitments we made. Our next stage is roughly 500K. Not particularly risky because you've heard these tools already being built. It's a modular deployment. 4 million to then launch what is effectively the mechanism that can then be scaled across city over city, climate over climate, agricultural system over agricultural system because you fix cost. So in essence, it's a mechanism that if you actually integrate from innovation all the way through to finance in exactly the same format as the bankers, the defense markets have done, that allows you to track the granularity, allows you to pay it, to incentivize each of those individuals so that they can collaborate and work together and get the benefit of that collaboration, to move away from a market that we've created. And we've created a market, very high marginal cost, very low marginal revenue, very few annuity models, to actually creating that collaboration of scale that addresses the high marginal cost, that captures a whole range of revenue that you can't in the current model, to actually liberate a whole range of capital. I think we'll call it there unless people want to ask specific questions. Have we time for questions? Probably not if people are desperate to have a drink. But we'll certainly be out there having a drink. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.